So I definitely see a number of questions coming in, and maybe we can invite Ziad to come back on screen. And maybe what we'll do is I'll just sort of throw out a couple of the questions that I have coming to mind, and maybe we can start, Miranda, with you. Just one of the questions I'm seeing is if you could just elaborate a little bit more on the Wellcome's focus on younger people for this first round of studies, and was there a reason that the trust didn't want to focus or didn't want to sort of take a full lifespan approach, or can you just elaborate a little bit more on that focus on younger individuals?
Yes, so I came into post 2 years ago, and at that point we'd made a decision that we were going to focus on early intervention in 14 to 24-year-olds in anxiety and depression. And Wellcome had a particular commitment to trying to look at that as a particular topic area. So these initiatives were developed at the point at which we were doing a specific project and program around that. Since then, Wellcome has decided that mental health is actually going to be one of 3 things it does. And so we're at this moment scoping how big that will get. I think at the moment we are currently still interested in whether we can think about early intervention as a particular focus, but it will be less narrow than we have had up to now, which has been on this 14 to 24-year-olds.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. So Ziad, maybe I want to go back to something that you had raised, earlier about getting psychiatry out of the other medicine evaluations. I think that's a really interesting topic, and I think it sort of highlights that obviously much of psychiatry, much of medicine is going to have a, mental component, physical component. How do you see this evolving? I mean, is it really as clean as what you're describing, or is it more about, maybe we can start using these data to have less sort of prestige put, I don't know if it's prestige is the right word, but sort of having a more integrated approach to medicine that does incorporate behavior and this behavioral components to medical presentations. So I don't know if you want to comment more on that, but.
Yeah, it's such a great question. I think for me, one of the things that was very striking in residency was how unscientific the process of diagnosis is. And I think that, there are lots of reasons for that, but let me put forward I think one that I've become really conscious of is that what is diagnosis? Well, it's you observe a very complex set of data about a person, and you turn that very complex set of data into a probability judgment of them being in a certain state. So that's kind of my somewhat nerdy definition of diagnosis. But I think for me, it is very helpful because diagnosis is fundamentally, this isn't like a complex, like causal inference problem. We're not trying to figure out, does treatment A or treatment B work? We're just trying to understand, is this person in a given state? And the reason that I think it's been so hard to get into a scientific framework for a long time is because our statistical tools were just not able to accommodate the complexity of those diagnoses. And so you see that in all these decision rules, like how do you diagnose depression? Well, it's depression plus, of these nine things, pick 5 or 4 or whatever it is. And that, I mean, I don't think anyone really thinks depression is that simple, but that's just what you have to do to get it into the human mind. And but now we don't have to do that anymore. So we can actually work directly with the raw data. And I think that's very promising. So I think that rather than having these categories of, depression versus anxiety, when, like 50% of people with depression have anxiety and 50% of people the categories are probably just like not quite right. And how could they be right? It's really complicated. Even the categories that separate psychiatry from the other disciplines are not quite right. So I think that over the coming years, as we get more and more data online and more real data, not just what a human says about a patient, but like what happens to the patient, how the patient feels, things like that, I think we'll be able to make a lot more progress on making diagnosis an empirical science and not just some, art where there's a master diagnostician who, knows what she's doing and everyone else is just kind of trying to catch up.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, maybe I'll just follow up with, you're bringing up interesting points about the role of diagnosis, and you mentioned state as well as, I think in behavioral health psychiatry, there's sort of a question about is diagnosis the concept we should be using, or is it more of the sort of a state identification where people with a diagnosis, say like bipolar disorder, are obviously going to move through different states over the course of their illness, and that's obviously true for medical conditions as well. But I feel like we get a little bit muddy, I think, in the realm of sort of improving psychiatric diagnostics when I feel like we don't even necessarily know how to identify the states yet in a quantitative way, and that other branches of medicine are maybe just sort of a ways ahead, and we aspire to have that kind of certainty, but without the data, as you're saying, it's just can sometimes feel like apples and oranges. But
I'd actually love to hear, Miranda, your view on this, because it sounds like you've been thinking about this a lot from this early intervention point of view. But I do think, ultimately we want to do diagnosis, but we want to do diagnosis for very concrete reasons. One is we want to know what's going to happen to someone, so there's a prognostic element to diagnosis. But the second is we want to know what works to make them feel better. And so I think that, sometimes that requires knowing what state someone is in now. Sometimes it requires knowing what state someone is going to be in now. I think there are these interesting corner cases like trauma, as the surgeons say, trauma is a disease. It's kind of interesting because clearly you're not in a trauma state now, but you might be at very high risk of being involved in interpersonal violence or a car accident or these things like that. So I don't think that there's a very precise, but if we knew that someone was going to be in a car accident, for example, an older person whose vision was declining and really shouldn't be driving, if we knew that, we would do something differently. So that's an important kind of diagnosis to make now. But yeah, I don't know if Miranda, you have a view on this from your work.
Oh, I think we're not hearing your audio though, unfortunately. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, and I don't know how to turn on the video, so slightly off-putting seeing my partner up live on the screen. I don't know how to get him off, so I will let you just find a way of removing him and putting my face there. But
no one else can see him besides us, so it's all good. Yeah.
It's like a ghost coming in. I'm having a Hamlet moment. Okay, so I completely agree with where you're coming from on this, and I think that in many ways the diagnostic categories in mental health have been our foe rather than our friend in terms of moving the science forward, because we have been forced to act as though they were real. So that 4 out of 5, it's 4 out of 9 or whatever, it's 5 out of 9 symptoms because a bunch of people sat around in a room and said 4 sounds sort of good and 5 sounds too many and 6 sounds too, there's no magic to it. And we know, for example, for depression, there are 280, I think, different measures of depression, very little overlap between them. So the heterogeneity between these issues is huge. That doesn't mean there aren't real problems that real people are experiencing that really relate to depression and anxiety and all the other sorts of mental health problems. So I think the way we are trying to think about it sounds similar to what both of you are saying, is how can we, what are the sort of targets that we should have, and should we be thinking about the targets in terms of the sort of problems people are experiencing and not seeing them necessarily as symptoms of an underlying coherent thing, but actually as a target in and of itself. So if people are struggling with anhedonia or intrusive memories or sleep problems, is that the focus that we should be targeting with our algorithms, rather than trying to target something that we know is heterogeneous and then actually just introduces masses of noise into our computations? So trying to take out noise, and I think I'm a clinician by background, a clinical psychologist by background, but I think one of the challenges for us is that in mental health, I think there's a lot of privilege given to those of us who are clinicians to help advise basic researchers. And I think we need to use that privilege very wisely, because there's a real danger that as clinicians, one says, I know what depression is, and then we introduce all our own biases and all our own assumptions and all our own, exactly as you were saying with the people doing the radiographers, not that they aren't expert, but they're not experts in some of the things that we need the algorithm to be expert in. So we almost need to take some of those clinical assumptions out and just look more directly at the elements that are holding people back.
I love that that way of thinking about it, Miranda, and I'd love to talk offline about some of the data work that we're both doing, because we sound aligned. But I was reflecting on there are a couple of papers that are done by psychologists over the past 10 years that generate this moment-to-moment happiness measure that has proven just in my personal life, it's been really transformative to know, for example, that the lowest point of most people's day is when they're commuting to or from work. Like, very important insight. Doesn't mean that they're depressed, but it just means that happiest moments like social time with family, things like so there are just these ways in which, now that we have these platforms to do data collection, we can gain this insight, not just into quote unquote depression or what we've been calling depression, but just in the normal evolution of someone's mood over time, what that means for them on a day-to-day basis, what that means for them on a longitudinal basis. And so I think that's really, really powerful. And I couldn't agree more that we actually don't need to put things into these boxes that we've been using for the past hundreds of years. We can actually create new boxes, and the boxes are probably going to be much smaller and better. And I think it's really exciting.
And I think that links to this issue about trying to understand trajectories of these problems over time. So I think we've made this distinction between the people that access healthcare, or the patients, and the rest. And we actually know, particularly for things like depression and anxiety, many people will have these difficulties who don't access healthcare. And unless we track their natural trajectories, we never learn the different ways in which those problems resolve or get exacerbated over time. So we're almost skewing our learning by not letting the algorithm look at the full range of human experience. So I think in mental health science, this transition between the sort of the norm of catching people's fluctuating emotions and then the extreme clinical end when people are disabled by real problems is quite a fluid one, as everyone recognizes. And we need to find ways to capture that full range through the science.
Great. So I'm seeing a couple questions about, so there's obviously innovations that you both are doing in terms of what kinds of data to collect, but even just how those data are being stored and sort of federated. And I think that's an interesting aspect, I think, to both of your work. We heard today about, Ziad, you'll have to remind me the system that you guys have built, and then, Miranda, with the work that Wellcome is doing with Sage, there's sort of new data models being explored. And I think one of the questions in the chat from Akshay, who I think was also involved with Sage, is asking about other non-centralized forms of data collection and governance being explored by Wellcome, and whether there's plans for leveraging the existing cohort studies that you're doing in the UK, US, and India. But maybe both of you could comment just a little bit more on sort of, as we begin accumulating these data sets of in many cases, identifiable information, but also even more like sensitive, personally identifiable information. What are the right data models to do this safely, to ensure that, participants want to keep engaging in research studies, that people want to get care from places that are, part of these data aggregation efforts? How do we ensure that? How do we future-proof it, knowing that the data sources and ways of encrypting things are going to evolve? Can you maybe, Miranda, maybe you want to start, and then Ziad can share as well?
Sure. So from a Wellcome point of view, we are absolutely trying to explore how we can capitalize on existing data capture, both in terms of cohorts and in terms of the opportunities that now the digital world provides to us. I think that we need to be really careful, particularly in mental health science and in psychiatry and psychology, around this issue of what counts as sensitive data. So traditionally, all mental health data has been seen as highly sensitive. And just thinking what Ziad was saying earlier, we all might collect happiness data, but that's big. If you start calling that mental health data, it suddenly becomes highly sensitive. Personally, I don't mind if anyone knows my happiness ratings data. That doesn't mean that there isn't personal mental health stuff I wouldn't want everyone to know. But in a way, by categorizing it as mental health, we actually are disabling the research community. So, before I joined the Wellcome Trust, I sat on a body that looked at requests to look at health data sets. And I was the mental health representative on it. And I think there was a view from others in the group, they were always very nervous about making those data sets available because of the, it's mental health. And particularly if you add mental health in children, it becomes really huge. Those were completely appropriate and important concerns, but I was often the one in the room saying, but if we don't look at this, we're never going to learn anything. We're never going to advance the science. So how do we get that balance between open? And I suppose my experience and why we were interested in this feasibility trial with Sage and others is if you actually ask subjects themselves, like, this could find a cure for your schizophrenia, there is a risk that some data in here might somehow, that there are risks always to identification. There is no such thing, I think, in the new world of it being completely and utterly promised and anonymized. But are you prepared to take this very small risk for this science or not? So conversations that we can have at a more general level, rather than if someone comes into a waiting room who is, for example, highly distressed, giving them 6 pages of consent forms to fill in about data at that point. So we have to find new ways of thinking about this that involve the public and those who are affected in actually helping us design these new stewardship models, and not getting too trapped by a legalistic model of this is what the regulator says, and therefore I now need to give you 20 pages at this point.
I could not agree more with that. And I think for me, how do we make any kind, like, what's the principle on which we're basing these decisions about what to do with data? Well, I mean, I think that we have infrastructure for this decision making, and it's basically, whether it's the specific stuff in the Belmont Declaration or just a general sense of, the benefits have to outweigh the risks. So I'm willing to acknowledge that maybe, mental health data, maybe that does pose more risk, but it also poses more benefit. So I think that, the general principle of beneficence and respect for people's privacy and individuality, that just has to guide the decision making. And I think people in general are very willing to give up privacy for when they're getting something back. Google Maps knows where I am all the time, but I don't need to print out maps anymore. So that's fine. So I think people in general are very reasonable. And I think we're able to make these trade-offs in our day-to-day life. So it's weird that in the research world, we're being forced to basically, like, we can't make any trade-offs because privacy trumps everything. It can't trump everything. It's very important, but it has to be balanced against, what good can this be creating? And I think that for me really helps focus the mission of the data and the research work on things that are really going to benefit people and outweigh any of these risks. In the US, the good news is that HIPAA, for all of its flaws, actually does provide a very clear and concise framework for what you can do with data and what you cannot do with data. I think the problem is that, a lot of lawyers and a lot of hospitals actually, they're not following HIPAA. They're going way above and beyond federal law and doing a bunch of stuff that actually doesn't make any sense and denying a lot of researchers access to data. HIPAA is, that's the law. I think, Miranda, you dodged a bullet because GDPR is far less reasonable than HIPAA. And I think that is going to shut down a ton of really good research on the continent for a long time, as soon as someone figures out what it means.
We have not dodged that bullet. It is still very much around for us. And I would say GDPR is around for everyone the minute you start to do any work in this area. And we have major issues around how people interpret GDPR because of risk. But I would also want to say we need to be careful as a research and clinical community that we don't just demonize the lawyers and the commercial companies. That I think researchers have to look themselves at how far they share their own data and how far they hold on to it, and the idea that, I'm going to write this paper that's going to make me X or Y. Yeah, it's taking me 10 years, but while I'm waiting for those 10 years, I don't want to share it with anyone else. So we need to find ways that we credit everyone for openness and for sharing and for allowing other people to use these data sets. And it is very easy to draw on some of these regulatory frameworks otherwise as a reason for actually what is a motivation to not share in the first place.
Yeah, and not study, as you pointed out. I mean, I think that's sort of the challenge is these are challenging ethical issues. And so, many people would just choose not to study them at all because they don't want to have to deal with, getting into those nuances. And I think our own take has just been, it may be in ethical gray area to allow people to contribute these very highly sensitive information to studies, but isn't it maybe even more unethical to not invite them to do so in the name of, you know, trying to advance the science and the clinical models? So I think, you know, this sort of issue, and you know, we don't want to, obviously we want to continue protecting vulnerable populations who might think it's okay to, you know, completely hand over their raw GPS, you know, to a researcher in the name of science and future progress. But there may be obviously usual, you know, instances where you wouldn't want to let someone who didn't have capacity to make that decision. But at the same time, you know, we often confront in psychiatric, you know, inpatient psychiatric research was brought up earlier, this issue of whether it's ethical to enroll someone who's hospitalized on a non-voluntary status. You know, so many people who come into the hospital who are acutely suicidal, you know, or are unable to, you know, care for themselves in some way or another. It's quite heterogeneous whether or not those individuals are even eligible to participate in research. I think, you know, we could go on for a while about whether it is or ethical, but I think just trying to find that right balance of not, you know, we do want to empower folks, regardless of their background, to be engaging and providing their data for themselves, for others. And I agree that it seems like when we've surveyed our clinical populations and research populations, by and large, individuals are okay parting with the data. It's the institutions that tend to have a little bit more of a problem with some of those privacy, you know, provisions, just as I think Ziad was highlighting in terms of who is coming after, you know, to really to enforce different aspects of those. So it's a really important question. There's another question I think that's coming up that's a little bit of a different angle, but maybe it's the question of ground truth in psychiatry. It's something I think that you know, goes a little bit back to what we were discussing earlier, but you know, the question was posed for you, Ziad, but I think it could be really for both of you is, how do you think about ground truth? You know, this is, you know, in the world of machine learning, you know, you have the modeling parameters that you're trying to actually estimate, and often there is a ground truth, sometimes there's not. I know there's different machine learning approaches to these problems, but you know, there's subjective experience, there's the objective data. How would you think about that, you know, as a clinician, as a scientist? And maybe Miranda, you can also comment. And then I think that probably was the last question for now, just we'll have to wrap up in a few minutes.
What a great place to end. I think that one of the ways in which practitioners can make huge contributions to this area of applying machine learning and AI to healthcare is in being very, very thoughtful about exactly that question. I think what often happens is that, you know, people outside of a particular field who are, you know, very strong on the technical side, you know, you've got the data and you've kind of merged it all together and you're so excited. It's like, okay, what should we predict? It's like mortality or cost, or, you know, and so, but that is by far the most important choice that you ever make when you're building a model. It's like, you know, on the one hand, like, oh, how many layers should I have in my neural network? Or like, what is ground truth? This is where we should be focused, but it's not currently where we're focused. And I think it's because it's hard, because you have to triangulate ground truth, usually across lots of different measures. You have to deal with things like Melissa raised. You know, someone's conscious experience in a moment is, of course, very important, but they are also a different person the next day. So how do you weight those different subjective experiences, the fact that you are yourself now, but you're a different person tomorrow with different feelings and different motive? Like, these are fascinating questions for psychiatrists and psychologists and practitioners to be answering and giving that kind of guidance to the technical people, because otherwise weird stuff is going to happen and we're going to get, you know, models that are not only inaccurate but also highly biased, as some other work that I've done has shown, and I'll post a link to that in the chat.
Great. Miranda, any last thoughts on this topic or anything else?
No, that was a very elegant. I've got nothing to add to that. That was great.
Excellent. Well, you know, again, this is a fascinating, important discussion. I think for those who are here in the morning session, also, you know, on the topic of sort of closing the mistrust gap in digital health, I think, you know, it's really a lot of the same concepts about how do we move forward directionally as a community and really work to make sure that all the communities that are affected by mental health continue to trust, obviously, their practitioners, but also researchers. And I think that these two presentations are really important for how to begin framing that. So many thanks to both of you.